And so when I thought about this series now turning into a book, there were people that were just on my dream list of just like, I think I'll reach out to them. And
one of the strongest tools of colonization is a map. How can you see what the physical place is? A designer, is going to design that map for you.
Hello, I'm Doug Powell. Welcome to This is a Prototype, the Design Leadership Podcast. One of my favorite design books of the last year is Centered, People and Ideas Diversifying Design, a remarkable collection of essays, interviews, and stories compiled and edited by my guest for this episode, Professor Kaleena Sales. This fascinating book spans geographical regions and cultures from Alabama to India and from Kurdistan to Zimbabwe, illuminating designers, techniques, ideas, and artifacts that have previously gotten little or no attention by the established Western design communities. The book provides important context for all leaders building inclusive, human-centered design teams and programs. Kaleena Sales, an active commentator and leader in the community of Black designers in the U.S., is the chair of the Art and Design Department at Tennessee State University, a historically Black university in Nashville, Tennessee. Later in this episode, Kaleena and I will be joined by one of the contributors to Centered, Sadie Redwing, a Lakota graphic designer and advocate from the Spirit Lake Nation of Fort Totten, North Dakota. Sadie teaches at the Ontario College of Art and Design in the Graphic Design and Indigenous Visual Cultures programs. We join my conversation with Kaleena Sales as she tells me about her backstory as a designer.
I grew up drawing. I was always, the one that was saying I wanted to be an artist. So when it was time to go to college, I chose studio art as my major. I had heard about, commercial art when I was in high school, and it sounded really interesting. I wasn't quite sure what it was though, and so, that phrasing was in the back of my head. So a lot of my time in undergrad was studying to be a fine artist. I was painting, I was drawing, and actually that was a really good foundation for me. I learned a lot about. I went to an HBCU where I'm currently teaching actually, and I learned a lot about. Like Black fine artists like Jacob Lawrence or Romare Bearden and Faith Ringgold and that sort of thing. And so that was really my foundation. And somewhere around, I would say like my junior year of undergrad, I became really terrified of the idea of being a professional artist. And I thought, oh gosh, I need something a little bit more secure. I think I was actually flipping through a magazine and I was looking at sort of the credits of the people that worked, in editorial. And I thought, what is an art director? And it sent me down a really lovely rabbit hole. And I discovered a grad program at VCU's, it was the Ad Center.
So it's VCU for our listeners, Virginia Commonwealth University.
Yeah. And so VCU had an incredible 2-year ad master's program. Anyway, that was my introduction into, this space. And so I was an art director after grad. I went to VCU. I got accepted some kind of way. And I worked as an art director for a couple of years. And just because of the way that the industry works, there were layoffs and I had to move back home to Nashville, and I started to really think about like what's next. And it was then that I started to think about like maybe I'll teach, maybe I'll pick up a couple of classes. And I started to work as an adjunct here at Tennessee State University. That was in like 2009. And so I've been here ever since. That's a bit of the backstory of how I am.
I'm curious about Virginia Commonwealth, if my memory serves me right. The history of graphic design book that I used when I was in college, I think was written by, was it Philip Meggs?
Oh, yeah.
Who was a long time, I don't know whether he would have crossed over with you or, but he was a long time professor at VCU.
Yeah, I believe so. I did not cross paths.
But interesting that, that there's that sort of institutional crossing of paths there, because that was sort of assumed history of graphic design, as the title suggests. And,
Absolutely, yeah.
And much of what you're doing with Centered is questioning that and challenging that and reframing much of that history.
Yeah.
Let me ask you one quick question about your backstory, which is so interesting in those moments of questioning and can I be a studio artist? And I'm wondering, for me, I went through many of those same moments of discovery and then moments of questioning. And my parents were very they'd never heard of any of this,
Right.
and they were very supportive. I'm very thankful that my parents, despite that, were always very supportive of me. But I wonder if what the conversations were with your parents. Kind of going through those stages.
So I'm a first generation college student. And so my parents were military, and then they did sort of different odd jobs. And they always knew that, again, I was the artist. And so I think they were fine with whatever I said I was going to do. They didn't necessarily understand it. It wasn't something that they would have had a lot of advice about or, suggestions for how to navigate. But generally speaking, we're fine with whatever I chose, and we're sort of just happy that it's like, okay, she's doing something that's that's seeming like it's working out. I was a really good student, actually like the valedictorian in my class. And I bring that up because I think that, I remember a lot of, not necessarily my parents, but just sort of peers and even counselors. And when I said that I wanted to pursue art, it was just like, what? You could do something else. You could, and I felt this sort of almost chip on my shoulder to prove that you could do something, worthwhile within the arts. And so because I was a serious student and an artist, I think that's also what made me really interested in advertising and like design, because there was that kind of intellectual challenge as well of just problem solving and the strategic sort of components. That's really what I think drew me to that sort of lane of the arts and the creative space. So yeah.
So interesting to think of that sort of assumption that the arts, it cannot be one's highest calling, Well, you're working hard to correct that. Well, let's talk about the book and just sort of your thinking and your approach to the book and what gap you saw out there that you felt needed to be filled with this collection of essays and interviews and conversations.
After I started teaching, I went to SCAD, Savannah College of Art and Design. I'd already been working and teaching for a while, so it was a little bit later. So around 2013, I was working on my thesis project for SCAD and sort of just trying to figure out what sort of research area I was interested in. And even back then, I was sort of wrestling with notions of underrepresentation in design and like my experience being a Black designer and also teaching at an HBCU and sort of wrestling with that, but not quite having it resolved. I didn't really know what my position was within that. And so fast forward to about 2018, AIGA's national conference was happening. They put out a call for proposals for conference topics that dealt with culture in some way, And so that was the first time that I'd ever submitted anything to present about my experience and my students' experience navigating design as a Black designer, as a designer from the South, and sort of thinking about the challenges that exist within that, and also some of the sort of like identity negotiations that you make along the way and how our identities get we compromise, I would say, our identities within our design work and in our portfolios. And so that was the first time that I think I sort of seriously started to write about it and present about it. And it kind of began back then. So when I joined AIGA's Design Educators Steering Committee and thinking about a way to contribute, I pitched the idea that we would do maybe an article series titled Beyond the Bauhaus, where we would just share stories of underrepresented cultures and communities who have contributed to design, but who had been overlooked in sort of the traditional design canon. And I wrote the first couple of essays on West African Adinkra symbols, and then another one on Afrocobra, which is an artist collective from Chicago who I love, and told their stories and then opened it up for contributors to send in other overlooked sort of narratives and histories. And that series grew a bit, and we, were able to successfully publish, a good number of short essays. And it was well received, I think, by other design educators. And that was really where the nugget for centered really sort of took shape.
Yeah, the scope of the book is, is vast, and it's so inclusive of these amazing voices. How did you find these stories? Did they come to you? Did you seek them out? Was it sort of an organic thing, or was it like, I've got to find that great story that I know is out there?
So a few of them were original contributors to the Beyond the Bauhaus series. And so there were, I think, 3 of the essays that were featured in Beyond the Bauhaus. And I thought, well, these are great, and there's room to expand this and write a bit more and dig into the research of these. The other ones were really easy to find, to be honest, because there's so much out there. Like many of the people that I approached to contribute to the book, I'd sort of crossed paths with in some way. Like I've seen a presentation that they've done or have read something of theirs, and I know that they're doing this incredible work. And so when I thought about this series now turning into a book, there were people that were just on my dream list of just like, I think I'll reach out to them and, and see
like
if they
give us an example of somebody who made them.
So Sadie, Sadie Redwing, I knew that she was doing incredible work about Indigenous sovereignty and visual design. And I'd never met her, though. I had never met Sadie. I think I'd seen her present a couple of times through, just various channels. Another person was Shantanu, who contributed the essay on the truck art of India. He and I had never directly crossed paths either, but we were, sort of operating within the same space where I was familiar with his work. And so there were many people that were doing some great work. And I just sort of was like, well, I think this is my chance to, to reach out and see if they might have the time. But there were others who were sort of a bit more of a surprise. Cheryl Miller, who's incredible. And I remember her sharing the work of Adolphus Washington, making a post about this incredible, collage artist. And I clicked on the link and followed his work, and I was just blown away. And he described his aesthetic as a Black aesthetic, and his, I think, social media handle was like Negrophonic. And I thought, this is fascinating, and so I had never heard of him. We were not sharing the same space or network at all. So I'm so grateful that for people like Cheryl Miller who are, digging out and sharing out these additional resources. And so that's how I came across him, who ultimately contributed an incredible interview and also did the cover design for the book. And so,
okay.
So there was a few different ways that the contributors took shape.
Yeah, well, and Cheryl Miller, AIGA medalist, renowned, just legendary figure in design for decades, who is, it's great to hear her in that, hear you talk about her in that sort of connector role. She's so great at that. She's got just this massive network. She knows everyone, and everyone knows her, and she's got, visibility, and how great of her to be, sort of available and to step into that role, which I know she does with a lot of joy.
Right, she does, and I appreciate her for that. And I think she's a really good example of someone who sort of walks the walk, I guess, and she wants to make herself available to be a resource. And so she contributed to the book as well. It all sort of just fell into place. I think in the right way, but there were particular things that I was hoping that each essay or interview sort of checked off, really in one or two ways. Either the work that was being discussed was overlooked or unknown in some way, under-recognized, and or lived outside of modernist Western design kind of norms. And so the practices or the ideas or methodologies were, different than what is typically featured, I would say, in a design textbook. And so those are the two areas that I was most interested in featuring.
Yeah, they needed to sort of challenge a lot of the assumptions of the, as you say, modernist-oriented, Bauhaus-rooted sort of narrative of what design is.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite essays in the book is by Dina Ben Ibrahim. And it discusses the beautiful rugs of the Amazigh people of northern Africa, what is now Morocco, and just a phenomenal story of these rugs being, really one of the ways that the history of that people have been told over centuries through just unthinkable disruption and colonialization over time, many times over. There's an interesting you phrase it as a warning at the beginning of the essay, and you write, "This essay recognizes craft as design. The frame of Eurocentric graphic design history deemed craft unworthy of the design canon. However, in indigenous spaces, understanding craft as design articulates new ways of knowing outside master narratives." I find that to be, one of the core ideas of the whole book, where you're sort of reframing, challenging and reframing this notion of what is design, and this assumption that if it's craft, it can't be design.
So I want to clarify, that's Dina's words.
Actually. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I was wondering. I was wondering. It's written
like it's above. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Good.
Oh, I loved it. She begins her essay, with 3 warnings, and sort of talks about what you just discussed. And I love that because, one of the issues with design, and I think design education specifically, is that, we've sort of upheld a narrative about design that almost has equated it with just like branding. And whereas, we know that cultures and communities have been designing since the beginning of time. I think Saki, in addition to Dina, Saki also, Mafandikwa, does an excellent job, I think, of discussing this in his chapter as well. So Saki Mafandikwa is a Zimbabwean designer who wrote the book African Alphabets. And I interviewed him. This relates to the question about craft and design and just really the definition of design in general, right? And how our understanding of the way that design has been defined has created problems within our industry. And so Saki says, what about the pyramids? What about the Benin bronzes? What about the terracotta heads of the Akan people of Ghana? What about Adinkra symbols? And so he goes on, and he gives examples of intelligent, sophisticated, beautiful design that's been developed and upheld throughout, from the beginning of time. In Dina's essay, when she writes about the rugs of the Moroccan women, she talks about the curation of narratives and the storytelling and the symbology and the deep meanings that are held within those designs. And this is not unique to those couple of cultures. This happens throughout the world. But in our conversations about design, because of the industrialization of design and just sort of the history of the practice, of contemporary graphic design, we've sort of erased all of that, and we've forgotten about it, and we've not documented it well. I think my biggest concern about that is what that does, I would say, to the psyche of marginalized people who are entering into design industries. What does that tell you when you think that you come from a people who have never contributed anything worthwhile to this industry or to this space when you believe that the only way to be a designer is to work in a corporate setting. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. I have no problem with that. I mean, I've worked in advertising, I think it's, it can be an exciting place to work within, but it does something to our devaluing of people and humanity when we don't recognize the cultural contributions and the different ways the design can look. And so that's really my interest in that conversation. It's from a lens of just wanting people to feel like they belong in the conversation and feel empowered to contribute.
And to see themselves in that history. To see themselves or to see versions of history that are beyond the mainstream, what we've always heard.
Absolutely, yeah.
There's so much in that essay. That's one of I have so many favorites from the book, but that's one of my favorites. Partly because the rugs themselves are just stunningly beautiful, and there so many of the examples that you bring forward are just gorgeous here. You brought up Adolphus Washington a moment ago, and his work. Also is just extremely powerful. Tell me a little bit about his backstory and his actual work, if you could maybe describe the work itself.
So Adolphus Washington, he works out of London actually right now, but I don't think that he would call himself a designer. There's a couple of folks in the book that I don't think that they would classify their work as design, but he's certainly interrogating, image and type and composition and all of those things. And I think has a lot to offer to the conversation, but he's a collage artist. He's a, mixed media artist from New York. And when you talk to him, he shared that he's just really, really interested in sort of working in the legacy of, I would say, like of a Romare Bearden. He's interested in representing work that's uniquely Black and American. We had a really interesting conversation where he made some distinctions between an African aesthetic and a Black American aesthetic. And he's really interested in what experiences Black Americans have had and how that shapes, our creative expression. And so he talked about work that's blues oriented, that dives into sort of complex issues that's unique to our history within this country. And so I would say that that's what's really, really unique about Adolphus's perspective. He's a historian. I learned in my Adolphus and I met for, I would say, about 2 hours on Zoom, where I just had a conversation with him, and we just, and ultimately transcribed that conversation to become the narrative interview that's in the book. But he's deeply rooted and really interested in sort of like the social and economic conditions of Black America, and much of his work, really showcases that. And it has a lot of heart. It's really authentic, I think, because of that. He's not just exploring sort of an aesthetic for the aesthetic purposes. He's really interested in how those textures and how those forms, translate ideas about, the experiences of Black people. Yeah, so I'm so honored that he agreed to be a part of the book. I think he has a lot to offer.
And the work is very much, it strikes me as very akin to, if you were to hold it up to the great poster designs of the 20th century, it is just absolutely deserves to be sort of in that category. And it is powerful. The hand lettering, the use of type and image and layers, and certainly provocative messaging is really very, very powerful.
Right.
Powerful. you write in your framing of that essay about collage, the historical Pablo Picasso and George Braque as being the sort of originators of collage, and you rightly do some correcting of that narrative and place Adolphus's work and other Black American artists in that same narrative and that same channel.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's really interesting, and one thing I'm particularly increasingly interested in, is just sort of Black creative expression across genres. And so, if Black people, were originators of soul music and blues and jazz and all of these, and have gospel roots and all of these other sort of soulful expressions, then how does that translate into the visual space, right? How have fine artists used that same experience and created, meaningful work, and what can designers learn from that? And so that resonates with me, as a Black American designer, from the South. But I think that we see that same idea show up in the mini essays across the book. When we see these really unique cultural sort of expressions that are informed by kind of the social, political, and other kind of economic happenings of those groups of people. And so I like that context. I like that people can read these essays and understand, what informed the making, what informed the colors or the textures that you're seeing. And what I don't want, what I was hoping to avoid, is that it becomes just sort of a flip through of just like, a beautiful work that, people will sort of ooh and ah about, but not really understand, again, the context of the making and the different value systems that inform it.
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the successes of the book, is that it strikes that balance beautifully. It is, as I said earlier, there are beautiful images from cover to cover here, and so, but it's such a readable and consumable book, and the flow of it is just very accessible and very easy to kind of get that context, from different points of view and different voices. I'm curious that this podcast is sort of framed around design leadership, and often I'm speaking to leaders of design teams and design programs in bigger businesses and companies, and I'm wondering what you think centered, how they might be learning and taking the messages of centered into their work as leaders, both leading designers, but also as business leaders, and sometimes in big, sort of scaled global companies.
I think that the book is just a sampling of work that's out there, and it asks everyone to sort of consider what you don't know, and to assume that each person who joins your team has a history and an understanding of the world that makes them valuable in that space. I think when we ask everyone to solve problems in the same way, that can be problematic, and it's limiting to the work that we can create. One example that I will give is this sort of speaks to this kind of need to not just diversify our teams, but to value the lived experience as sort of a benefit in creative spaces. As when I worked in advertising, I was the only Black designer. I was really the only designer of color in the space. I was an art director, and I was also seemingly from a different socioeconomic background than most of the other people in the office. And I remember we had a client who, in the banking industry, and that client needed us to do, I guess, some ad work for a new service that they had that was for like a second chance kind of account for folks who had bad credit or had ruined, maybe their first go around. And we were being a big meeting where the creative director and lots of other folks were in this meeting. We were talking about this internally. Lots of other folks on the team did not understand the client, did not understand the consumer, did not understand how someone could be in a situation where they would need this second chance, account. And there were comments that were insensitive, I think, that lacked empathy. And I think that you get that empathy and you get better informed work when you have a group of people who don't share the same background, And so I would encourage, design leaders or anyone that's in a position of power to think about, what diversity adds to the team, not just in skin color, obviously, right? And not just for optics, but just for that range of life experiences. And so that we're not all approaching problems with the same solution. And I think that's what this book it's really sharing that there's a diverse range of solutions that are possible if we value other narratives. Yeah, I hope that design leaders can take something from that.
Yeah, no, that's so beautifully said. In an era where not only is the composition of our teams overly one-dimensional, but I would suggest that the output of those teams has become overly one-dimensional, and there's just so much, so much similarity, and from one, whatever it is, brand or design system, there is such a risk to just being invisible unless you're able to find ways to inject new points of view and new voices.
Yeah, and I think, sometimes people, when I've gone out and talked about issues of diversity within design, some of the questions that people ask is like, well, how do we really do that if, our client is, let's say it's a corporate client with, doesn't have a particular, aesthetic, cultural aesthetic. So how do we do that? I think that is a challenge. I would say that one of the ways to think about that is to think beyond aesthetics, right? And so there's a lot that we can learn from diverse methodologies that live much past aesthetic choices. And so, for example, one of the things that I learned from Sadie Redwing was about traditional ecological knowledge and sustainability and taking care of the land. And so what can I learn from Sadie that can help me just to make better strategic decisions about sustainability practices? Or, what can I learn from Dina and the Moroccan rug makers? It talks about storytelling and narratives within design. So there's so much that we can learn that moves beyond just aesthetic conversations. And I think that's sort of one takeaway also that I hope folks will take from the book.
That's Professor Kaleena Sales discussing her book Centered: People and Ideas Diversifying Design. In the second half of the episode, Kaleena and I are joined by one of the contributors to the book, Sadie Redwing, a Lakota graphic designer and advocate, and a design educator at the Ontario College of Art and Design. Let's listen as Sadie tells me her backstory as a designer.
So I'm a 90s kid. Like, I grew up in the age of Y2K, where now we're able to have the starting of social media. So I was in that MySpace area where I had the chance to curate anything that I want behind a computer screen. So my exposure to, I would say, more of the creative side, where I felt most creative, was behind a computer, thinking about where I might find education with those strengths. I really wanted to go to tribal college. I was dead set on going to a tribal college. Grew up with family members who went to tribal colleges. So it's definitely been a safe space for me. One of the areas where a tribal college was looking for students interested in graphic design was the Institute of American Indian Arts. So I went to II down in Santa Fe. They had a new media arts program. And they have, beautiful programs. They have film program, museum programs. So just be immersed on the college campus around Indigenous creatives, all eager to be educated in a profound profession. The challenge was being in the field of graphic design. I wasn't necessarily learning the traditional canon of how you learn graphic design. Bringing all of that to North Carolina State University, where I got my master's in graphic design, this is kind of my first time being exposed into research, kind of more of a European influence. And I think what's just unique in my track is, well, how do I balance being taught this form, I guess at the time, or how people might categorize it, a little bit more primitive. And now I'm at NC State and we're talking about future trends and technology and talking about, designing for the future. And I think what I was driven as an educator, researcher, or someone as a student, I was struggling. How can I combine these two experiences? If I'm in a situation where we're seeing more tribal nations' sovereignty recognized, we need educated designers in those spaces. But it was just hard to find either a degree track or professional development training that would get a student in the realm of design into these spaces, working with indigenous demographics. Tribal governments, the United States are ready. We just don't have the population of educated graphic designers to be in these spaces. Pushing those research ambitions really started to just open like doors and conversations and just finding your piece of the puzzle where you fit in the larger design community. So it's been a wild ride. So again, just in thinking about, there's just a need when it comes to resources, people. It's just, the wave is there. So we're riding it. I'm just very fortunate just to be in a space up at here at OCADU where I can bring in both of those areas of expertise into one. And then just to see the beauty of it's like I feel needed in that sense. So I'm very, very happy and very have this profession and be able to share it with you, Doug.
Yeah, no. And in this moment, I was about to ask, as you were talking about moving from the tribal college into NC State, were there role models for you in that transition?
Yeah, I think just having a college function as a college and kind of recruiting a particular demographic and having those educated perspectives is still fairly new. So meaning that going to an art school like I feel like a lot of mentorship or a lot of motivation came from painters, came from pottery makers, jewelry makers, fashion. There wasn't necessarily a large area of expertise in design. And so I feel like when I left I had the skill sets of kind of hustling fine art, just in the means of how do you critique? How do you communicate what you're doing here? How can you be persuasive? How can you sell it? How can you curate something where it might be in a gallery space or museum space? And all those skills I brought with me. The mentorship I received at II at a tribal college was specifically more cultural and history based. Going into NC State is a little bit more, what's the process?
Yeah,
what's the process?
Yeah, interesting trajectory there. And Kaleena, I'm remembering your backstory earlier in our discussion here, which had some similar notes of your undergrad experience in studio arts, and then moving into more of a sort of professional practice orientation in your grad experience.
Yeah, for sure. Just like I said, when I was in undergrad, learning about art through the lens of the fine arts and studying, artists from the Harlem Renaissance and things like that, and not necessarily understanding design at all, really. But then getting that later, in grad school at VCU, and then also when I went back again to SCAD, from what I'm hearing Sadie say too, sort of like transferring that knowledge in a way, and figuring out what are the transferable skills that I learned from my HBCU experience. How do those Black cultural experiences translate and inform the way that I understand the world, and then, can now design, now create design solutions for other people. And I feel like that's maybe some similarities to what Sadie is sharing as well.
Yeah. Sadie, you've in the interview and between you and Kaleena in the book, there's this just beautiful passage that you tell about the nomadic lifestyle of the tribal communities and the impact that lifestyle has had on what we can call design, but really in sort of historical narrative and storytelling and symbology. And I wonder if you could kind of tell us about that or idea there and what you were kind of reaching for in that passage.
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing that will make sense in understanding indigenous visual languages is you have to understand how a tribe works based on the area they're located in the United States. So if you're a tribe near the Grand Canyon, you might not be as nomadic as somebody that might be from the ocean, or let's say the Pacific or Atlantic coast, where you might have a culture of voyaging, so you might have more canoes. You follow maybe more of the ocean patterns coming from the Dakotas, the Midwest with the Great Plains. We didn't have mountains. We didn't have a lot of trees. So we're following animal migration patterns. If you're a place that's a little bit more woodland dense, so going into Minnesota, into Wisconsin, as you get into New York, buffalo can't go through all those trees. So folks within the woodlands areas aren't going to be as nomadic. So I think just kind of understanding just the generals of what indigenous culture is, it kind of helps build, okay, well, it might make sense that in my area where I come from, the Dakotas, it's a very simple lifestyle. We're always following the buffalo. In the sense that if you're nomadic, you're always on the go. You are not going to accumulate a lot of things. So I think in the realm of graphic design specifically, we learned the printing press. And if you come from a culture that isn't nomadic and you're in one spot, the printing press works because you can make books. Those books can go on shelves. It can go into libraries. But if I'm somebody where I'm always camping, I'm always on the go, that's too much weight. That's too much weight. That's too many things to carry on my horse. So I got to be strategic. So again, if we're going to document something, we're going to go in the form of semiotics. So if I'm always on the go, I can only take what I have with me. It would make sense that this symbol can help me remind me of an oral history versus me reading a 200-page book. So I think just generally grasping some of those concepts. So for example, if it's not so much nomadic, maybe I'm a farmer and I come from a farming culture in New Mexico, there might be a greater sense of archives where you might see more cellars with pottery pieces or just things that can be saved in one place.
As you evoke the printing press as the core tool of what mainstream design history has sort of been framed around, you instantly in this story, Sadie, you instantly sort of make that you reframe it, and Kaleena, back to kind of one of the core ideas of the book that we were talking about earlier, this sort of tension between design and craft, or the assumption that craft can't be design, is instantly just sort of redefined in Sadie's in Sadie's anecdote there.
Yeah, it makes so listening to Sadie even just again reminds me of the conversation we had when we met over Zoom, and it really makes me want to do an audiobook version because people need to hear this from your voice, and I think that happens in the essay and the interviews and that sort of thing. But Sadie just gave us a history lesson in just a few short minutes, and many people have never heard about, that many people are not aware of. And there's space in those textbooks. There's room for these conversations and for, these cultural sort of lessons, and it doesn't have to be dominated by, this Swiss design narratives. And it's a disservice to people, to students, to not learn any of this. And so I appreciate, Sadie sharing that. And from what I'm hearing too, is that I think one of the challenges that I hear you kind of expressing, Sadie, is just that there's so much that we don't know that it becomes a challenge for you to then think about, how do I even answer this question without giving the context? And there's so much context when there's so little known about indigenous, practices and histories, right? And so to even have a conversation about design, it's like there's layers that have to, be informed first, right?
Depending on where you went to school, you may not have been, exposed to anything. So, man, if you just knew a little bit about us, it would probably make a little bit more sense. But as someone who's indigenous, or say here, I'm in Canada right now, right? And everything that is different here in Toronto than the United States that I'm going to bring back with me here pretty soon is that I see English and I see French culture on everything. What if I was in the United States and I saw English and, Lakota or English or Navajo, English or Cherokee on everything? It works up here to have two different, languages on everything, like from Gatorade bottles to cereal. But it's just like when I'm in the United States, like how come that isn't possible in the States?
I'm thinking of as you're talking, reflecting on your experience in Canada and the dual language there. I spent time in New Zealand recently, and New Zealand is in a really interesting moment of integration of the indigenous Maori culture into the colonializers' European culture, and it's clunky, it's hard, right? It's not integrating cultures and histories and languages is not a smooth thing, but they strike me as remarkably committed to that idea. And road signs, city names, the name of the country, now has both languages reflected, and you hear it sort of integrated into the language, really, again, it's not always smooth and easy, but people are really doing it there.
Oh, I mean, New Zealand, man, like just so much respect. And in thinking about, there's so much, just that connection, just that concept of indigeneity is seen in every continent. So meaning that, there's the similarities across the board, across the globe, is that every single thing roots from the land. So food, language, inventions, that all comes from the land. And I feel like if you're somebody not indigenous to that land area, you just may not grasp those concepts. So for example, like if we were going to do like an indigenous design conference, there is going to be similarities from all the designers that might come from maybe indigenous tribe in Africa, indigenous tribe in Australia, indigenous folks from Asia, and everything that we're going to be connected is land-based. Seeing how indigenous culture is influential in the places like New Zealand, I feel like there's a beauty to it. And I feel like I want more of those same relationships, nation to nation, and here, because our knowledge is needed. And if DEI is moving into a more climate change, sustainability friendly aspect, like you're going to need land-based experts.
Sadie, you discuss in the interview in the book the power of maps and of mapping as sort of important artifacts in the telling of the history and in the teaching, sort of the instructional aspects of the work. Can you talk a little bit about the map as an artifact?
Yeah, so I feel like as Indigenous designers, we're always tackling the conversations around decolonization and decolonialism, but again, going to the basics. If someone has no clue what that word colonization is or how it was different than colonialism, how can I really simplify those aspects so that I'm not wasting all this time, still trying to define it. But so just to quickly define those, and it'll give a little bit of an idea where the map comes in. So when we're talking about decolonization or colonization, think of place, think of land, like the actual physical, like where we're at. How either maybe a government came to overrule, exploit those resources, changing the ecosystems and terrain. The central of the North American continent was prairie, but when you have cows and corn crops, and in the Midwest is known for our cows and corn, to me, a colonization model is destruction of that land. So cutting down the prairie and bringing in pollutants. So corn crops pollute, cows pollute. You're cutting down the prairie, not knowing how much the prairie is valuable to the ecosystem. One of the strongest tools of colonization is a map. How can you see what the physical place is? A designer is going to design that map for you as visually communicating, a government or ownership of a land base. So anything when it comes to like just policy or norms, that's more in the conversation of colonialism. Colonialism affects everybody, but I feel like Indigenous people, when we're talking about, again, land-based, our conversation is going to be more stronger in the colonization conversation. And then maps.
Yeah. Sadie, I asked this of Kaleena earlier in our conversation, but I wonder if there is a message that you have for the leaders, the professional leaders of design, many of whom might work in a big company, be overseeing big teams of designers. Is there a message that you would send to them about the themes of the book and the themes of learning from indigenous cultures that you're talking about here?
Yeah, I would say if you're still in conversations around DEI, like you're falling behind. We're going to be hit with conversations around climate change and sustainability. If you don't have indigenous people, bringing in those perspectives, be included, to know what resources you need in those spaces, you're falling behind. If we're going to simplify or be more eco-friendly, bring in indigenous knowledge. Like, that's all we know. All our inventions were made without machinery or destruction or exploitation. My question is, how come people in the United States don't know shit about indigenous nations? Well, they're not visually communicated. I feel invisible. Who's going to create the visual? The graphic designer is. So that would be my 2 cents.
That's good. That's awesome. And that is a great, I think you stuck the landing there, Sadie. I think that's a great way to kind of put an exclamation point on this great conversation. Thank you, Kaleena Sales and Sadie Redwing, for joining me on this conversation.
Thank you so much. This was fun.
Absolutely. Thank you. It was good to meet you, Doug. It was good to see you, Kaleena.
That's all for this episode of This is a Prototype, the Design Leadership Podcast. Special thanks to Scott Leach of Brand Speak Communications for his production assistance, and to Graham Barton for his original theme music. I'd love for you to help me grow the audience for this podcast by liking and following it on your favorite podcast platform. And I'd also love your help finding great design leaders for future episodes of the show. Please reach out to me on LinkedIn with your ideas. You can find out more about my work as a design leader on my website, dougpowell.design. That's all for now. We'll see you next time.